Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 249, Processed Meats, what they are and what actually makes them a concern. Hi everyone, welcome back to Real World Nutrition. I'm Shelley Rael, registered dietitian nutritionist, and I'm glad you're here this week. Now, last week's episode 248, I talked about red meat. And if you listen to that episode, you may remember one of the points I kept coming back to was that not all red meat is the same. Leaner cuts are different from higher fat cuts, and processed meats really deserve their own conversation or their own episode. So that is today's episode. Processed meats are one of those foods that tends to generate two very different reactions. On one end, you'll hear people say that they're basically poison and they should never be eaten because people like to say things like that. And on the other hand are the people who say, well, we got to go some way, so they don't give it a second thought. And of course, as with all things, most things in nutrition, it's neither extreme is helpful, and it's almost always somewhere in between those two extremes. Now, most health organizations agree processed meats are not foods we should emphasize in our diets. But does that mean you should never enjoy a hot dog at a baseball game, or a BLT during the summer, or a turkey sandwich for lunch? No. And just today, I had someone who was I was in a group class and we talked about bacon among many other things. And someone was horrified that somebody else even brought up the topic of bacon. We've got to find this medium here where people can accept that it's okay to have it once in a while if that's your preference. So today, I want to talk about what processed meats actually are and why they receive so much attention from researchers, and readdress the terms like carcinogen and what that represents in the concept, or I should say in the context of processed meats, and how processed meats can fit into the bigger picture of a healthy eating pattern. And if you would like to read more after today's episode, as I always do, I've linked the companion blog in the show notes. So I want to start with the basics here. What exactly is processed meat? Now, sometimes people assume processed meat means that meat comes in a package, and that's not what that means. Processed meat refers to the meat that has been preserved or modified to improve flavor, extend shelf life, or change its texture. I do want to step back for a moment and say, hey, all meat is processed because the meat that we get, if we buy at the grocery store or wherever we get it from, doesn't look like the original animal it came from, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm talking about processing in a different context here, of course. So when we're talking about processed meats, there's several ways that this can happen when it's been modified to improve flavor, extend shelf life, or change its texture. So the meat may be cured, it may be smoked, salt may be added, it may be fermented, preservatives may be used, or a combination of those methods. And some of these methods have been used for centuries because when we didn't have refrigeration, they needed a way to preserve those meats. Now, some common examples of processed meat includes bacon, sausage, hot dogs, deli meats, ham, pepperoni, salami, and many breakfast meats. And one thing that people don't always realize is that processed meat isn't limited to beef or pork. It can also include turkey, it can also include chicken, it can include other meats. And the important part here isn't the animal the meat came from, it's how the meat has been processed. So sometimes people have this idea that turkey bacon is somehow better when it comes to a processed or cured meat. Not necessarily. And here's a question that comes up. Are deli meats processed? People will say, well, I don't eat processed meats, but I have turkey sandwiches. And in most cases, turkey is processed. That's if you're getting deli turkey. The same goes for many deli hams, roast beef, chicken breast from the deli counter, many packaged lunch meats. These products are often cured, preserved, seasoned, or treated to extend shelf life. And I want to make this clear. That doesn't automatically make them terrible foods. It simply means they fit within the processed meat category. But here's a clarification. Not every deli meat is identical. Some products contain fewer ingredients. Some have less sodium. Some are freshly sliced from whole muscle meats. So it could have the turkey breast is intact and then it's sliced in front of you. That's a little bit different here. Other deli meats are formed, restructured products with long ingredients lists. So with all of this context, these are differences that matter. But to put it in a more broad nutrition perspective, most deli meats are considered processed meats. Now, here's another question that comes up. What about products that are labeled as natural or uncured? And this is where the food labels become interesting because you'll often see products listed as natural, at least I've noticed this, or they're listed as uncured. So how can we have a sausage that's uncured or natural? And many people assume that this means they don't contain nitrates or nitrites, but in reality, it's not so straightforward. So this idea of having nitrates or nitrites that are not synthetic. So instead of having synthetic nitrates or nitrites, manufacturers often use ingredients such as celery powder or beet juice. And those ingredients naturally contain nitrates. So the processed meats still contain nitrates. Just they're coming from celery powder or beet juice, a natural food. But does the body really care whether that came from a laboratory or from celery powder? Because chemically, they're very similar. And while the label may sound more appealing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the product behaves differently in your body. That doesn't mean companies are trying to trick people. They're following label regulations. And they're not lying. But a lot of people are under this assumption that because it contains natural nitrates, that it's somehow benign. And that's not really the whole story here. It's a reminder that marketing doesn't mean it's healthier. So what are nitrates and nitrites? I'm using those two terms and not explaining here. So these are the compounds that receive a lot of attention when we're talking about processed meats. And they're added for several reasons. They help preserve the meat. They reduce the growth of harmful bacteria, which is a good thing. They contribute flavor. They help maintain a familiar pink color we associate with foods like ham and hot dogs. And without them, many processed meats wouldn't look very good or taste the way consumers would expect them to. So why do they receive so much attention? Well, under certain conditions, nitrates and nitrites can contribute to the formation of compounds called nitrosamines. And some nitrosamines have been linked to cancer development in research studies. So that's one of the reasons processed meats have been studied so extensively. But here's the other point that surprises people. Nitrates, they're not unique to processed meats. In fact, many vegetables contain much larger amounts of nitrates than processed meats, like spinach, beets, arugula, celery, lettuce. And these are all naturally high in nitrates. So why are we telling people to avoid vegetables, or why aren't we telling people to avoid vegetables? Because, as always, the context here matters. Vegetables have more than just those single components. Most of them contain vitamin C, antioxidants, fiber, and many other compounds that appear to reduce the formation of those harmful byproducts. So the food matrix is different. That's one more example of why nutrition isn't about isolating one nutrient or one component from a food and saying how harmful it is. It's about looking at the whole food and ultimately the whole eating pattern. So what about processed meats and cancer? And this is where many headlines begin. You've probably seen articles or at least heard people say that processed meats is something that causes cancer. It is classified as a group 1 carcinogen. And again, I briefly mentioned this, or I mentioned this a bit last week's episode, but of course I'm going to cover it again. A group 1 carcinogen. So it sounds like, oh, having that piece of bacon, I'm going to get cancer. And that sounds alarming, but that's not how it works. So again, it's important to understand what that classification actually means. The World Health Organization classifies substances based on the strength of the evidence that they contribute to cancer. And notice what I didn't say. I didn't say that they classified them according to how dangerous they are. Those are two different things. The classification tells us how confident researchers are that there's an association that exists. But it doesn't tell us the size of the risk. And unfortunately, these two ideas often get confused in news headlines. People hear group 1 carcinogen and assume that eating a hot dog carries the same risk as smoking cigarettes. And that's simply not what the classification means. So again, think back to the discussion from last week. Risk depends on many things. How much, how often, how long, and what the rest of your lifestyle looks like. The research consistently shows that higher intakes of processed meat over long periods are associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. But that doesn't mean someone develops cancer because they ate bacon with breakfast one weekend or have a BLT now and then. Health risks generally develop through long-term patterns, not isolated meals. And that's an important distinction. And again, we have to look at those eating patterns. If you're having a BLT once in a while, but then the rest of your diet and eating pattern consists of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and lean meats, that's a big difference than somebody who's eating a corn dog every couple days. So what about heart disease? Cancer isn't the only area that researchers study when it comes to processed meats. Higher intake of processed meats has also been associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Why? Well, there's probably not one single explanation. Processed meats tend to be higher in sodium. They are some are, I should say, higher in saturated fat. Some contain preservatives. And again, people who eat large amounts of processed meats may also have overall eating patterns that differ from people who only eat them occasionally. Nutrition research is rarely able to point to one ingredient and say, this is the entire explanation. Instead, we look at patterns. And once again, those patterns tend to show that higher intake over time is associated with greater health risks. And I want to continue by looking at another health condition that often comes up in the research, and that's type 2 diabetes. Some studies have found that people who consume higher amounts of processed meats have a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Now again, I want to emphasize the word association. An association means two things are observed together more often than we would expect by mere chance. But that doesn't mean one caused the other. People who regularly eat large amounts of processed meats may also differ in many other ways. Maybe they eat fewer fruits and vegetables. Maybe they consume less fiber. Maybe they exercise less. Maybe they smoke. Maybe they have different sleep habits. And researchers work hard to account for these differences, but boy, nutrition research is so complex because when we're studying people who live their lives freely and they're not confined to laboratory conditions because that's for the most part, unethical, we have to look at these associations. So this is why you hear me come back to the same message over and over. The overall eating pattern matters. Now here's a question here. Are plant-based meats healthier? So over the last several years, grocery stores have added many plant-based burgers, sausages, deli slices, and other meat alternatives. And people assume that these products are automatically healthier. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't. Many plant-based meats contain less saturated fat than traditional processed meats. They may provide some fiber, which traditional processed meats do not, because fiber only comes from plants. But on the other hand, many are still highly processed foods. Some contain significant amounts of sodium. Some have long ingredient lists. Long. Some contain coconut oil, which contributes saturated fat. Coconut oil is higher in saturated fat than butter. So again, the context matters here. If someone enjoys a plant-based burger occasionally as part of an overall balanced eating pattern, that's one thing. If someone assumes a plant-based hot dog is a health food simply because it's plant-based, that may not tell the whole story. So this lesson isn't plant-based alternatives are bad. The lesson is plant-based doesn't automatically equal healthy. I encourage people to read the nutrition facts label, look at the ingredients list, maybe compare it to the other the animal-based products, and consider how that food fits into the rest of your diet. So, should you stop eating processed meats? Well, for most people, I don't think that's a useful question. Some people already don't anyway. But the better question here is, how often are you eating them? Most health organizations recommend limiting processed meats rather than eliminating them completely. And that word, the key word there is limiting. Not banning, not fearing, not pretending they don't exist, not judging somebody because they had a hot dog. Limiting. If your breakfast every morning is bacon or sausage, your lunch is a deli sandwich, and dinner includes pepperoni pizza, that's a very different eating pattern than someone who enjoys a hot dog at a summer barbecue or orders a sandwich with deli turkey once in a while. How often, how frequent, that's important. So let's bring this to the real world. Imagine you're standing in the grocery store. You're looking at the deli case. Maybe you're packing lunches for work. Maybe you're trying to get dinner on the table quickly. What should you do? Don't assume every option is exactly the same. If you have a moment, compare products. Some deli meats contain considerably more sodium than others. Some have fewer ingredients. Some are made from the whole muscle cuts instead of chopped and reformed meat. Freshly cooked chicken or turkey that you slice at home can also be a great option, but do you have the time? Let's be real. Not everyone has time to roast a turkey breast every Sunday afternoon and slice it up and prepare their lunches for the week. Sometimes convenience is important, and that's okay. If deli meat helps you build a sandwich that also includes whole grain bread, lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, maybe avocado, some fruit, you still have a fairly balanced meal, and that processed meat is just a small portion of it. That sandwich doesn't suddenly become unhealthy because it has deli turkey. And could you rotate other protein sources sometimes? That's another consideration. So maybe one day you have hummus, another day you have leftover grilled chicken, another day you have tuna salad, maybe peanut butter, maybe beans in a wrap. Variety is a great nutrition strategy. And then, as this is coming out, it is summertime. So what about those special occasions? So this is where nutrition advice becomes disconnected from the real world sometimes. Think about summer. Maybe you go to a baseball game. Maybe you go to a neighborhood cookout. Maybe someone fires up the grill on the 4th of July or Labor Day weekend or Memorial weekend. Hot dogs may be part of this tradition. Brats or other processed meats like that. The goal here isn't don't feel guilty because you had a hot dog at a family gathering. The goal is to recognize that, as I said already, the occasional hot dog at a celebration is very different from relying on processed meats several times every day. Food is more than nutrients. It's traditions, it's celebrations, it's family, culture, memories. Nutrition absolutely matters, but so does enjoying life. And I want to talk about the bigger picture here. This is now the second episode in a row where I've ended up saying the same thing. Actually, I say this a lot because it's one of the biggest lessons of nutrition research continues to tell us. Individual foods matter, but overall dietary patterns matter more. If someone asks me if a slice of bacon is healthy or unhealthy, that's not the question I want to answer. If someone asks if an overall eating pattern built around fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains, lean proteins, healthy fats, regular physical activity, and occasional processed meats can support good health, the answer there is much clearer. Health isn't determined by one breakfast, one lunch, one barbecue, one holiday meal. It's the pattern over months and years that has the greatest influence. So I want to wrap up with some of the highlights here. Processed meats are meats that have been preserved or modified through methods such as curing, smoking, salting, fermenting, or adding preservatives. That includes foods like bacon, sausage, hot dogs, ham, pepperoni, salami, and most deli meats. Natural and uncured products often use naturally occurring sources of nitrates, such as celery powder, rather than synthetic ones. And from a chemistry standpoint, those nitrates are processed very similarly in the body. Research has consistently found that higher intake of processed meats over time is associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer, cardiovascular disease, and possibly type 2 diabetes. This does not mean one serving causes disease. Risk develops through long-term patterns. Plant-based processed meats may be useful options for some people, but they're still processed foods, and you want to evaluate them individually rather than automatically assume them to be healthier. And most importantly, nutrition is not about labeling food as good or bad. It's about understanding how foods fit. Processed meats don't need to be a dietary staple. They also don't need to become a source of fear. Enjoy them occasionally if you choose. Build most of your meals around foods you eat more often. And remember, your overall eating pattern will always matter more than one food. And with that, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Real World Nutrition. And if you found this episode helpful, I'd appreciate it if you shared it with someone who has questions about processed meats or has ever felt confused by conflicting nutrition headlines. And don't forget to check out the blog, the companion blog with this week's episode. As always, it's linked in the show notes, and it goes into even more detail about nitrates, food labels, and the research behind today's discussion. And then next week, I do want to mention that I'm changing gears a bit. I'm going to talk about something more positive. I don't know, I tend to think a lot of these are positive as I clear up misinformation. But I'm going to talk about superfoods and functional foods and nutraceuticals and asking whether they really deserve all the attention that they get. All right, and until then, remember that eating healthy is not about finding one perfect food or avoiding one specific ingredient. It's about building an eating pattern that supports your health and fits your life. And with that, thanks for listening, take care, and bye for now.